Hello, hi, welcome to OFFBEAT GYAN. This video is on the Christian writers of the Anglo Saxon period. The literature of the Anglo Saxon period can be divided into pagan literature and Christian literature. Pagan literature refers to the oral songs and sagas that came to Britain with the Anglo Saxons from the Scandinavian region. That means after the Anglo Saxons arrived in Britain, the pagan religion that they had believed in, it gradually disappeared. But it continued to influence the life and imagination of these people. Much of the Anglo-Saxon literature was copied by monks who introduced certain changes. They introduced certain Christian elements into these works, into these songs and sagas, in order to give them a religious color. So, Christianity in Britain was brought in by literary monks who were very well versed in English and very well trained in Latin, and their influence is clear in English prose and poetry. There were a number of small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and these kingdoms were always fighting against each other. When these wars came to an end, two different schools of Christian influence arrived in England. The first was Augustine, who came from Rome, and the influence of this branch of Christianity spread in South and Central England. And the most important place for this particular school of Christianity was Essex. So this branch set up schools. They managed to educate some of the Anglo-Saxons, but it did not produce any useful literature. The other group, Christian group, was led by Aidan, and Aidan had come to England from Ireland. Ireland during that period was a center for education and religion in Western Europe, and the monks of this group, they worked mostly in Northumbria in England, and they played a very important role in shaping Anglo-Saxon literature. And it was this branch of Christian influence that produced the important writers Bead, Cadman and Cinewulf. And it also helped in the establishment of the great monasteries of Jarrow and Whitby. So the first important poet that we are talking about is Bead, poet, scholar, and somebody who documented that age, that is Venerable Bead. He is considered to be the father of English learning. He wrote in Latin. Last work was the translation of the Gospel of John. Wrote nearly 40 works, and all these were about the people of his time. And these books were so well written that these manuscripts were copied by monks in monasteries across Europe. His greatest work, as you all know, is the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. It is full of personal accounts of great events provided by abbots and delightful stories about saints and missionaries. That was a period when people believed in miracles, and they were deeply influenced by the kindness and the courage shown by monks. So the acts of courage and kindness of the monks were soon converted into stories, and they became stories which retold the great miracles performed by saints. Next we come to Cadman. Cadman, certain lines of his greatest hymn I have put on that slide, and those lines were actually written sometime in 665 AD, and they are found at the end of Bead's Ecclesiastical History. So these lines, they actually belong to the first hymn in the native English language, and it is by Cadman, the first poet about whom we have details, the first poet whose name and date are known. Cadman is referred to as the Anglo-Saxon Milton. So Bede's account of Abbess Hilda and her monastery at Whitby provide an account of the life of Cadman. The free and condensed translation of Bede's account reveals that In the monastery of Abbess Hilda, there was a monk who was blessed by God. He was not able to read, but whatever was read to him from the sacred scriptures was transformed into sweet and beautiful poetry by him. Bead said about Cadman that he was unlike any other English poet, and his poetry was a gift from God. So, Cadman's poetry was free from vanity and materialism. Cadman was a very shy and reserved ordinary man. During those times, it was customary that whenever there was a feast, every guest had to sing. Cadman did not sing, and he usually left such gatherings whenever he was asked to sing. But once he left such a feast, and he went out to look after the horses. That was his task. That was the duty that was assigned to him. He fell asleep after completing his task, and he felt the presence of someone standing near him and asking him to sing. And this voice was very persistent. So Cadman told this voice that he could not sing, and that is why he had left the feast. But the voice was very persistent, and the voice told him, "You must sing. You sing about the beginning of creation." And Cadman began singing verses that he had never ever heard earlier. The next morning, Cadman remembered what he had sung, and he added a few more lines to it. Then he informed the steward of the monastery about his gifts. So the steward took him to Hilda, Abbess Hilda of the monastery of Whitby, and he sang the song that he had composed while sleeping. So the people there, the monks and the abbess, they felt that the grace of God had been bestowed upon him, and then they decided to test him. They told him some Latin scripture, which he had to change into poetry. He returned the next day with a beautiful poem, and then Hilda invited him and his family to live in the monastery. Cadman became one of the brothers, and the entire story of the Bible was narrated to him. He changed it into beautiful poetry, and he sang it to his teachers, who became his devoted listeners. Cadman's greatest work is Paraphrase. It tells the story of Genesis, Exodus, and part of Daniel. Remarkable poetry, great insight, imaginative depth. It does not seem like a paraphrase, and it expresses Anglo Saxon love of nature. Bead said about Cadman that he transformed the whole course of Bible history into most delightful poetry. But there is something that is certainly confirmed, that most of the works which were attributed to him were probably not written by him. That means it was the contribution of several writers. But the paraphrase discovered in the 17th century is attributed to Cadman. Again, this also is considered to be the compilation or the contribution of many writers along with Cadman. Over a period of time, a lot of interpolations must have occurred. This book begins with a hymn that praises God and then describes the exile of Satan and the fallen angels from heaven. Then it tells the story about the creation of the world, the story of paradise, the fall, and the deluge. Another important work that is attributed to Cadman is that of Judith. This again is a story from the Old Testament in which Holofernes, a cruel and wild Viking, is feasting and celebrating in his hall. His head is chopped off by Judith with his own sword, and she throws the head down before her own people. And her people gain courage, they rise to fight, and they succeed in battle. The next poet is Cinewulf, Cynewulf, Cynewulf. These are the different pronunciations that I found on Google. So I think I'll stick to Cinewulf. Nothing much is known about Cinewulf, the greatest Anglo Saxon poet of all time. His work came to light only in 1840. He was the only Anglo Saxon poet who mentions his name in the verses he wrote. The other poets did not sign their works, but Cynewulf, he wrote it in secret runes, and runes are letters of the old northern language. And Cynewulf used the runes to represent not only letters but also certain words beginning with that letter. His greatest works: the Christ, Juliana, the Fates of the Apostles, and Eileen. These are the works which are signed by him. Other poems are attributed to him, but they do not have his signature, like Andreas, Phoenix, Dream of the Rood, Descent into Hell, Guthlac, Wanderer. These are works which are unsigned by him. The last one, Riddles. Riddles is actually a collection of literary puzzles in poetic words. Some of the most beautiful poems are The Swan and The Swan's Spirit. The Christ is a poem in 3 parts. First celebrates nativity, second is about ascension, third talks about doomsday. It depicts the punishment of the wicked and the joy of those who have been saved. Cynewulf's sources are the church liturgy and the religious speeches of Gregory the Great. This poem is dominated by the poet's feeling of deep love and respect for Christ and the Virgin Mary. It expresses the emotions of spirituality of Latin Christianity in its beginning stages. There is a fragment in this poem where life is compared to a sea voyage, and this is echoed in Alfred Tennyson's poem Crossing the Bar. Please remember these facts because these can always turn up as objective questions or multiple choice questions. So please remember that. Cynewulf's epic poems, Andreas and Eileen, are his greatest works. Andreas again is an unsigned poem, and it depicts the story of Saint Andrew. He had crossed the sea in order to help his comrade Saint Matthew to escape from the cannibals. The young captain of the ship turns out to be Christ, and Matthew is freed. The cannibals change their ways and join the Christian path. It provides one of the best descriptions of the sea in Anglo Saxon poetry. Eileen is about Constantine's vision of the cross before the battle. He wins the battle, and then he sends his mother Helena, Eileen, to Jerusalem to look for the original cross and the nails. This is one of Cynewulf's last works, and he has signed his name in runes. Vision of the Rood, if it is accepted as Cynewulf's record or his work, then it is a documentation of Cynewulf's search for the cross, which he finds within himself. It also suggests the future Sir Launfal and his search for the Holy Grail. So with that, I conclude this quite long presentation on Christian writers of the Anglo-Saxon period. Thank you.